welcome to 21 Kilohertz, the art of money in music. My name is Kenny White, and joining us, or maybe I'm joining him, I haven't figured it out yet, a guy who is the founder and former CEO of Audium. He was the founder, former CEO of TuneCore. He was the GM, or maybe he still is. Is your music label still around? Spin Art Records?
Oh, no. We shut that down in like 2006.
Been dissolved.
Where have you been?
And now his latest venture is a company called Word Collections. It's based in New York City. Please welcome, like I said, maybe you should be welcoming me, Jeff Price. Hello, Jeff. Hello, Jeff Price.
Hey, Ken. Thank you for doing this with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for asking me to do this with you.
You're welcome.
Happy belated Thanksgiving and happy Hanukkah, early Merry Christmas, all that stuff. We got to get that out of the way. Otherwise, it'll be hanging over our head. Anyone who's listened to the 21 Kilohertz podcast before is probably familiar with your new company, Word Collections. But for those who are new to the program, before we get into all the recent news about what's going on in the industry, what does Word Collections do and how does all this work?
Well, thanks for asking. Word Collections is a copyright administration company, which is like watching paint dry. It sounds really boring, but it's really important. When there's a recording, let's say you're George Carlin, the comedian, right? And you do a comedy routine called the 7 Dirty Words You Can't Say on Television. Very funny routine if you haven't heard it, worth watching. And so back in 1972, George Carlin signed a deal with a record label called Atlantic Records, and Atlantic Records recorded him. And Atlantic Records owns that recording. It controls that recording. But George Carlin wrote the words that got recorded.
Okay.
And Word Collections works for the author, the person that wrote the words that got recorded. It also works for those that wrote songs that get recorded. So it works for both songwriters and spoken word authors. And the exact same copyright situation applies when a recording is streamed, let's say, on Spotify. Spotify needs 2 licenses. License number 1 is to the recording. So with the George Carlin example, it'll get that license from Atlantic Records. They sign a contract, right? Then it needs a second separate license to the author of the words that got recorded, which also happens to be George Carlin.
Okay.
So they would need to go and get that second separate license, and then with that second separate license, make these royalty payments. But lo and behold, it appears they didn't do that. And it wasn't just them. It was every streaming service in the world. It was digital radio stations. So all these comedians, Richard Pryor, Robin Williams, George Carlin, Margaret Cho, Billy Crystal, just go through the list. In every example, these comedians' second copyright, that second separate copyright, because they're the author of the words that got recorded, don't appear to have been licensed, and they haven't been getting paid their royalties, which is different than music, right?
Well,
like Arista Records.
I don't know, is it?
Well, it is.
Well,
Arista Records hires Whitney Houston to sing I Will Always Love You. Right. So Arista Records gets paid when that recording streams, but Dolly Parton wrote the lyric and the melody. And there were mechanisms put in place to license and make payments to Dolly Parton, but there weren't mechanisms put into place to license and pay George Carlin, even though it's the same copyright and it's the same principle.
Now, what makes the spoken word the spoken word? There are music artists who create their music without instruments, like Bobby McFerrin, Pentatonics, anyone who sings a cappella. Are they getting paid for the composition and the performance? And if so, why are the works that they create different from the spoken word of like George Carlin?
You know, that's a great question. And the answer is, when does something become a song versus being spoken word? And the answer is, it's a gray line. There is no technical definition of that. For example, when we speak right now, if I begin to say Kenny, 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 like,
that's kind of catchy,
line? Right? Well,
yeah.
But the question is, when does it become a song?
When I start beatboxing,
you could.
I won't.
But when I appreciate
it's a new windscreen. I don't want to get it all spitty.
But the interesting thing is, when it becomes a song, the rules change. There literally are laws that say, hey, if it's a song, then X, but if it's not a song and it's spoken word, then Y. Now, clearly, George Carlin speaking isn't a song. And clearly, Bobby McFerrin, God, I can't even say his name. Help me out here.
Bobby McFerrin.
Thank you. Clearly, Bobby McFerrin singing Don't Worry, Be Happy, even though that's all him vocalizing, is a song. And where's the line? If someone's just speaking on top of a beat and a rhythm, is that a song? Technically, it appears to be, yes. But there are definitely going to be some blurred lines and some gray areas.
Now, once again, Jeff Price, it seems you have disrupted the status quo in the industry and have commenced with some feather rustling. And there have been an avalanche of articles about this in various media. On the night before Thanksgiving, just this past week, Spotify removed thousands of comedy tracks by performers like Robin Williams and John Mulaney and Jeff Foxworthy. Dozens and dozens, I don't know how many artists. How many artists were taken down? Much material?
I don't know. What occurred is, you're correct, is before Thanksgiving, apparently a large number of spoken word comedy albums were removed from the Spotify music service or the Spotify streaming service, right? And all of these albums that were taken down appeared to come from one record label called 800 Pound Gorilla. Robin Williams was listed as one of the albums taken down. Robin Williams actually is a client of Word Collections and sits outside of that. The Robin Williams albums were actually taken down at the beginning of November for probably different reasons, but they're kind of getting lumped in with the story. And it's an interesting story. All these comedy albums are just gone.
So why hasn't Spotify taken down all spoken word comedy? They're just taking down the stuff where they think there's going to be trouble.
I don't know the answer to that question. I can only tell you what I read. It's the same things that you read. Apparently, according to what I've read, there was a back and forth between this record label called 800 Pound Gorilla and Spotify in regard to unpaid royalties or missing licenses, which appears, from what I read, to have triggered the takedown of these albums.
Now, Spotify has released a statement. And because I am a conscientious podcast person, I have printed out that statement, and I have it right here. And it says,
makes it official. Yeah,
here
it's
is
official now.
Here is Spotify's statement about this situation. It says Spotify has paid significant amounts of money for the content in question and would love to continue to do so. However, given that some people are disputing what rights various licensors have, it's imperative that the labels that distribute this content and Spotify and those companies get together to resolve the issue to ensure this content remains available to fans around the globe. So they're saying it's not our fault. You guys are messing up or getting in the water and shaking things up. So what's the deal? Who's responsible for coming up with a system where people can get paid money they're owed, or we can figure out if they're owed the money at all?
Well, it all goes back to copyright law, right? Copyright law is just simply the rules. It's the way the game is supposed to be played. There's human law and there's natural law. Natural law is things like gravity. Can't do anything about that. It works the way it works.
Damn.
Everything else is just made up monopoly rules. And the made up monopoly rules say, hey, listen, the minute a person makes something tangible by either writing it down or recording it, they get a copyright. And when they get this copyright, it's called intellectual property. And if somebody else wants to use your copyright, they need to get permission. They need to get a license. And usually with a license comes a royalty payment, right? And those are the rules. And then the question becomes, how do you get the license and what are the royalties? Now, as we discussed before, there's two different separate ones. There's one for the recording, which is usually owned by a record label. And then there's a second separate one, which if it's spoken word is from the author, like George Carlin, who wrote the words, 7 dirty words you can't say on television, and then recorded them. Two separate copyrights. So how then does a Spotify or an Apple Music, et cetera, get these licenses, right? That's the question. And what's important is if they don't get those licenses and they use the copyright anyway, they're now infringing on copyright. And if you infringe on copyright in the United States in particular, we have a very unique legal system that says if you take someone else's stuff without permission and you infringe on their copyright, you can be sued for something called statutory damages. And statutory damages is unique to this country. You can recover up to $150,000 for each willful, it's a legal definition, willful infringement. So for example, if you're George Carlin and you have 10 comedy routines on an album, and all 10 of those comedy routines are infringed upon, you could potentially sue the entity that stole your copyright without a license, infringed on it, for 10 times $150,000, which is $1.5 million. Now, Ken, to your point, there were, many albums taken down, spanning hundreds, if not thousands, of comedy routines. Do the math, right? What is 1,000 times 150,000? And all of a sudden, you start getting into astronomical numbers. I'm actually going to cheat here. 150,000 times, yep, here we go, times 1,000 equals $150 million. Yeah, it gets real expensive real fast. Now, it has to be defined as willful, which has its own legal definition, but you can see the liability to an entity that's using the copyright without a license can go up substantially very quickly. And the amount of money that can be awarded is at the discretion of a judge or a jury. Right? If you go to trial and you argue this thing, and it's determined that the infringement was indeed willful, which is a bar they have to reach, then the jury or judge can award up to $150,000 for each individual willful infringement. So get real expensive real fast. So if you're an entity like a Spotify or an Apple or an Amazon or a YouTube, or even a Sirius XM radio as an example, a digital radio station, you want to make sure you're licensed up, that you're not taking people's stuff without a license, because you could be pursued for these statutory infringement damages.
Sure.
So when that happens, right, this stuff could come down, because by taking it down, you're trying to stem the bleeding and stop the infringement. Particularly if someone says, hey, you're using my stuff without a license, if they continue to use it after that, it could make it easier, hypothetically, to suggest it is willful. You're doing it intentionally. So that's where this mess is coming from. So what I see happening is you have one side going, hey, you're not paying the royalties and you don't have the licenses for this stuff. And the other side going, oh shit, I'll tell you what, we're just going to take this stuff down right now. And that way we can stem the bleeding. But it's also, a bit of a power play, right? Because Spotify has just gone back to the record label. Remember, this is what I think is weird about this is you have a record label that distributed the recordings into Spotify. And how long have those recordings been live in Spotify? 5 years, 2 years, 10 years? I don't know. And the record label's been making money off of the sound recording side. And then at some point, like I guess before Thanksgiving, they go, hey, even though you've had this stuff from us up in your service for maybe a decade, and we've been making all this money off of it, we've decided today we're going to tell you you're doing something wrong. And at that point, Spotify says, well, let's just pull this stuff down and figure it out.
Oh, okay, we'll take it down. Their attitude, or maybe it's their business plan, seems to be, let's just get as much material as we can on our site and make as much money off it as we can until someone complains or somebody brings forth litigation or threatens litigation.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's not make as much money as we can. I agree with everything you said, except for the make money part, because if you look at Spotify's public filings, they lose money, and they have lost money since they've existed. Every 3 months, their quarterly reports, they show that they lose money, sometimes over $250 million every 3 months. But yeah, I know, but they're publicly traded in the stock market, right? And their market cap, how much they're worth, is north of $35 to $40 billion. So the value in Spotify isn't that they're profitable, that they're making profitable cash. The value in Spotify is the market share, how many people use it. And Wall Street rewards market share. It's like if the value of a record store, like the old days Tower Records, was predicated not on how much music it sold, how many records they sold, but how many people walked into the store in the first place. And that's the way something like the Spotify gets valued. Clearly, it doesn't make money. So it's valued on the fact that it has, 100 million users around the globe, or whatever the number is. And that in turn gives it a stock market value, which then allows the entities and the people that own shares in the company to make money, like the original founders and investors in Spotify. When that company went public, it wasn't making money, but the people that owned the original shares of the company were now able to sell them publicly in the stock market. And lo and behold, they became literally billionaires.
Yeah, well, it's an odd business model for me, but I understand that it works for them and they've been making a lot of money off it, not in a traditional sense, but there have been several articles written about this subject in the past week, and on the Fox Business website, there are some comments from readers, and one I found very interesting from someone named Casual Observer. You probably read it. I want to get your reaction to their comment.
Oh no, this is virgin territory for me. This is gonna be interesting.
They write, Casual Observer writes on the Fox News website, sounds like the greedy comedians are trying to double dip and get paid for their performance and again as writers of the material. I get that many big name comics don't write all their own material anymore, and comedy writing can be valuable intellectual property. However, all of that value is rolled up into the final recording performance and compensated when the comic pays the writers and the comic's label or distributor pays the comic. If I buy a Ford F-150 from the local Ford dealership, that's the end of the transaction. I don't expect to receive an invoice the following month from the guy who mined the ore that became the steel used in the truck's frame, nor from the voice actor who narrated the commercials. They all got paid at their stages of production. They don't get another plate of seconds now.
Well, that's simply not true, particularly if there's patents involved in the technology in the car. And when the car is bought, the entities that control the patents or the technology get paid a royalty. And I can almost understand the perspective. It makes me mad to hear it.
But the end user or the dealership doesn't have to pay again.
Because the money is flowing where it's supposed to go. What's happening here is someone, to use a potentially analogous example, is purchasing a car, and the car that they purchase has technology in it that was stolen from somebody else. And it was stolen from that somebody else without a license or permission. And then the entity that's getting paid all the money has just made money off of someone else's work. It needed to go get permission and a license from that other person to put that technology into their car, which is the reason why the consumer bought it. It's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, but it certainly does apply. And I couldn't disagree more strongly with the writer of that particular message. You know, George Carlin wasn't George Carlin until he was George Carlin. The Beatles weren't the Beatles till they were the Beatles. And to suggest that they shouldn't be compensated for a second separate copyright as codified in the law makes no sense to me. Is he also suggesting that Dolly Parton should not get paid when the recording of I Will Always Love You by Whitney Houston streams? Is it simply because Dolly is rich, so she should be prejudiced against and not allowed the benefit of the laws that exist on this planet? And what about someone that isn't successful yet? What about Sarah Silverman before she was known as Sarah Silverman, as popular as she is? Simply because she is rich now, or succeeded because she ground her against that flywheel for decades trying to make it, she should now be penalized and not get paid properly and get a license for her work? What if somebody wants to cover it? So I just disagree very aggressively with that statement. The reason why someone else isn't getting paid is simply because the entity using it chose not to make sure they had the license.
There was an arrangement made at the beginning, much like Spotify made a deal with these record companies for the material. And are you suggesting that those deals should be torn up and a new deal needs to be made?
Am I suggesting that? No, I'm suggesting you just follow the rules the way they exist today. It's all laid out on how it's supposed to work. The problem is the entity, in this case allegedly Spotify, went out and said, screw it. We're not going to follow the rules. We're just going to steal someone's stuff and not pay them. Just like I'm going to go manufacture a car, steal other people's technology for cars, stick it into my car, and then sell it to Ken and get away with that transaction because I stole his technology. You know, it's not right. I just couldn't disagree with that person more.
I mean, if I buy a stolen bike, I don't want to have to pay for the bolt cutters later on.
Well, bolt cutters is a different conversation than a unique piece of intellectual property.
You mentioned Sarah Silverman and that she wasn't always Sarah Silverman and she had to work to get where she is.
Right.
Which is, and here's another comment from another reader of whatever it was, Fox Business News. The reader's name is missing part of the story. And they write, quote, I know Spotify makes a lot of money streaming other people's work, but an argument could be made that it provides free ads for the comedian or musicians. If nobody is playing your stuff, how are you ever going to get people to buy tickets to see you? It seems what they want is money up front. They, I assume, being the comedians. Asking for money from a source that promotes you is greed. The smart ones will stay on with Spotify and take advantage of the publicity. The others should die off from lack of exposure. What say Jeff Price?
Well, that's just silly. First of all, Spotify is not actively promoting these comedians, the albums.
But they're putting the work out there. They're making it available for the general public.
They're making it available to be found if searched for, right? It's not like Spotify is actively stepping forward and marketing and promoting these comedians. The comedy albums are there to be found. So to suggest they're being promoted is absolutely incorrect. The second thing is, who the hell are you to decide what a comedian should or shouldn't do? They should have the choice. It's their choice. It's their copyrights. It's their intellectual property. It's their career. And I support any comedian or any musician in determining what they'd like to do. If a comedian or a musician or a songwriter would like to enforce the laws that exist for what they create, then go right ahead. If they'd like to waive those rights and say, you know what, I don't want to be paid because I'd rather go down this other path, I support that as well. What I don't support is shoving it down the artist's throat and telling what they have to do, as opposed to allowing the opportunity to choose. And no, I couldn't disagree with you more. If Spotify wants to use comedy, okay, and they don't want to get licenses, you know what? They can go create their own comedy. And they can go perform their own comedy. But you know what? They don't. You want to know why?
Because they're not funny.
It's hard. It's not funny, and it's hard, and it's difficult, and they don't do it well. Gosh, that's why the comedy has value. You think Robin Williams began as Robin Williams? He worked at that for decades of work. And now that he's succeeded in his comedy and his culture has value on a global basis, you're going to turn around and go, well, screw him because he wants to get paid for his work. How about you go to work and we don't pay you?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's very frustrating to hear, but I do understand the perspective because copyright is confusing. It is. It's a confusing, archaic infrastructure that nobody understands. But honest to God, who forced Spotify to go and use other people's stuff in order to create their multi-billion-dollar market cap? No one made them go. You could go sell shoes, right? No one said you have to make a company that's based on using other people's stuff to make your fortune. Go make your own stuff. And if you don't, that's okay. But then get licenses and make the payments. And don't cry when you get caught.
Spotify is obviously not the only streaming service out there. And do you think that the companies that will play by the rules, which are still in flux at this point, will be the cream that rises to the top, and other companies that decide, oh, we're just not going to have any of these comedians on our streaming service? You think that they're going to go away?
Well, that's another great question. And it's interesting because in the old days, you had 10 to 12,000 record stores just across the United States, right? And each one would carry some similar inventory, but others didn't. You would have different things in different stores.
That's where I used to buy my 45s, Jeff.
That's right. You walk, barefoot, naked uphill in both directions to get there.
Exactly.
Now, the entire planet, I mean, we're not just talking the United States. Now, the entire planet, there's Apple, Amazon, Spotify, YouTube. I'm running out, right? There's like 4 or 5 places, not 20,000. So there's sort of a monopolistic control over the dissemination and distribution of media and culture, locked into some of the largest technology companies on the planet, some with literally multi-trillion-dollar market caps in the stock market. So you're kind of handcuffed a little bit, right? If you don't play ball, you are shut out of the market because there isn't anywhere else for you to go. They dominate it so desperately. It's so unequivocally. There's the word I'm looking for. But yes, if there is a value to comedy, And the Amazons and Apples and Pandora, Spotify's, Sirius's, YouTube, Google's of the world believe that they need comedy to attract market share and users, then one of them not having that will work to their disadvantage. So if Apple Music has it and Spotify doesn't, Apple Music's in a better position. And they need it. They need comedy. They need music. They need movies. And there will always be this tension. But if you're going to create a system that uses other people's stuff, you got to go and get the licenses and make the payments. And with music, there was some sort of infrastructure put into place. And there really hasn't been one put into place for spoken word. And it's not just comedy, by the way. It's Muhammad Ali. It's Malcolm X. It's Amanda Gorman. It's Eric Bogosian. It's spoken word. It doesn't have to be funny.
Are podcasts included?
Absolutely. If this podcast right now, the fact that this is being recorded, this now has a copyright. It has the recording and the underlying words that we recorded. There are two copyrights here. And if somebody goes and takes this podcast and pretends it's theirs and begins to exploit it, they've just infringed on our copyright. You can't do that. Well, you could, but you shouldn't be allowed to, and you're not legally.
Sure.
So,
if spoken, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I was going to discuss the infrastructure that exists for music that doesn't exist for.
Please do so. Well, it's interesting that I have so many streaming services on my TV, Netflix and Paramount Plus and Hulu, and the streaming services that have the content that I want to view are the ones that I watch, and those programs have been paid for by the streaming services. I think that there's this unreasonable expectation by the end user that everything should be available to everybody all the time on whatever service they have. And it's simply not the case, or if it is, it shouldn't be the case. And that sounds like what you're kind of railing against.
Well, not necessarily, or maybe certainly. It's different with audiovisual, with movies, right? Because you've got Paramount, who has its own thing through NBC, and then you've got Netflix that produce their own content. What's different here is Spotify isn't producing its own content, right? It's licensing it from other people, the way Netflix used to. When Netflix began, it got licenses to other people's stuff. And then it began to manufacture, produce, create its own stuff owned by Netflix.
Well, even the stuff that they produce, though, they're just buying it. They're not producing anything. They're basically buying the license to a particular program and making it available.
Well, but they're making it theirs. Spotify
and they can stick their name on it because they own it now.
That's right. And Spotify isn't going out and buying the Beatles catalog, at least not yet. They're not out going and saying we're going to be a record label and produce our own content or buy our own content. Instead, they're still in we're going to license it from other people. And because they're in that we're going to license it from other people, and there's a finite number of record labels, let's say, all the streaming services want to do a deal with those record labels, and those record labels want to do a deal with a Spotify or Apple Music because it's part of the ecosystem. It's how they make their money. Right? And the way it worked with Netflix when it first started. When Netflix first started and got over the hump, eventually you had everybody licensing them their content. Now that some of the places are pulling back because they're like, we want to be like Netflix too. But with music and comedy and spoken word and these albums that get released, it's all coming from the traditional legacy players. And by the way, the new DIY constituency, which is all these individuals around the world, which are not part of the traditional record label system. But it's all coming from the same hose, and Spotify, Apple Music haven't become music production companies or comedy production companies for audio only. Apple does produce TV shows now, right? And Apple Plus. Spotify doesn't do that yet. But with music and spoken word recordings, it's still all coming from a few places. So yeah, they all want everything because they believe in the long tail, and they want to make sure the consumer has access to everything when it comes to audio recordings. And what's interesting is with music, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too far on this, but with music, the way it works now in the United States is if you're a streaming service like a Spotify or an Apple Music, if you are a member of this new thing called the Mechanical Licensing Collective, it means you automatically get a license to that second copyright. With music, it's called a musical composition. So if you're a member of the Mechanical Licensing Collective, bam, instantly you have a license to all of the world's songs, not the recordings of the songs, but the songs themselves, like Dolly Parton's I Will Always Love You. And then they pay the money to the Mechanical Licensing Collective that is earned by a Dolly Parton, a songwriter. And then the Mechanical Licensing Collective is supposed to pay the Dolly Partons or the company that work for the Dolly Partons. But what's interesting about that is that only applies to music under the law. It's section 115 of US copyright law. It has to do with non-dramatic musical works. In other words, if the recording is not of music, then you cannot get the license through the Mechanical Licensing Collective. It's different. And what else is interesting is the license through the Mechanical Licensing Collective for the royalty. The royalty rate is actually set by the United States government. Dolly Parton cannot go and negotiate her royalty rate for her song. It is dictated by the United States government under something called the statutory rate, which is part of the compulsory license. So Dolly Parton is compelled to have to give a license to Spotify, whether she wants to or not. And the royalty that she's paid is dictated by the government, which happens every 5 years. There's something called the Copyright Board, the CRB, that meets, and people argue in front of these judges, these 3 judges, as to what the royalty rates should be. Spotify is trying to lower them. Dolly Parton or the representatives of Dolly Parton are trying to raise them, and these judges determine what those rates should be. And right now, by the way, Amazon, Spotify, Pandora, and YouTube, Google are lobbying and arguing with these CRB judges right now to lower the amount of money they pay to the Dolly Partons of the world. And if the judges rule in their favor, it will decrease the amount of money that gets paid to the Dolly Partons every time a recording of their song streams. But you know what? For Richard Pryor, Robin Williams, George Carlin, Ron White, Bill Engvall, these are all clients, by the way, of word collections. That rule doesn't apply. They're not subject to the compulsory license, and they are not subject to the statutory rate because they are spoken word. And there's the hole. Right? Nobody wanted to deal with this. Oy, what a headache. So what happened instead is the record labels are pointing their fingers at Spotify and going, man, you're responsible. You're supposed to get the licenses and make the payments. And the Spotifys of the world appear to be pointing their fingers back at the record labels and going, no, you're responsible. You're supposed to do it. And in between the two of them, there's this huge pile of money, right? There's over 1 trillion streams with a T of sound recordings of comedy in the last 8 years, which would have generated over $1 billion in royalties. And guess what? They've never been paid. Right? And these guys are pointing at each other. So one of them's wrong. And I think it's going to end up in some form of litigation because somebody's got to force the issue. Someone's got to pop the zit.
And from what I've read, that $1 billion doesn't include another $500 million in earned but unpaid royalties that are sitting in the Mechanical Licensing Collective.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so first we got the global song spoken word royalties. Now to call them royalties is a little disingenuous because you can't have a royalty if there's not a license. A license dictates the royalty rate. If it isn't licensed, there's no royalty. It's just infringement. But assuming things were licensed and assuming you had a royalty rate similar to what music gets paid, yeah, it's easily over $1 billion. Now, what you just referred to has to do with music, not spoken word. And this is what, remember, the Mechanical Licensing Collective can only license and collect for non-dramatic musical works. Music.
So non-dramatic would be a dramatic or theatrical musical release would be something that's produced for a TV show or a theatrical.
Well, now you're getting to another great question, another rabbit hole.
Also,
what is
not
the definition
not spoken word, but there are soundtracks.
There are dramatic.
Yeah, that are spoken word. If you buy the West Side Story.
Think of things that were produced. So what's the definition of a dramatic work? It's something that was produced for a theater, Broadway, let's say, the musical Hair or Jesus Christ Superstar or Cats, or, possibly Eminem's song, Lose Yourself. Lose Yourself, which is a massive global hit. He was commissioned and hired specifically to write a song for a theatrical movie release, 8 Mile, right? And that is in some ways a dramatic work. So the question is that eligible for a non-dramatic musical work license? But that, again, different rabbit hole. My point is that the Mechanical Licensing Collective has been handed almost $500 million, which is money that's owed to the songwriters like Dolly Parton's, that was generated over the last 10 years that Spotify and Apple, et cetera, just never bothered to pay.
So where is that money now? Where's it sitting?
It's sitting in the bank account of the Mechanical Licensing Collective. And the way the law works that created this thing is called the Music Modernization Act, which was signed into law in October of 2018 and basically came into effect in January of 2021. The way that law is written, it says, hey, listen, with all this money, the old money, like $500 million, and any new money that's made on the go forward, if we can't figure out who to pay, either because we have bad technology, we made a mistake, we can't find the person, we can now legally steal their money and hand it to others based on their market share, like Universal, Warner, and Sony, who also just happen to sit on the board of directors of the Mechanical Licensing Collective. And that's a whole other problem.
You are listening.
As it sounds.
You are listening to 21 Kilohertz, the art of money in music, and we are speaking with Word Collections founder and CEO, Jeff Price. What is going to happen with these comedians? Do you run into any comedians who are not crazy about your idea? Has anyone told you, hey, Jeff Price, quit rocking the boat. I don't want my stuff taken down.
Well, I'm not about taking stuff down or not taking stuff down. I'm about just simply helping people get the licenses they're supposed to get and getting a commensurate royalty and putting that money into the pocket of the creator. It's nothing radical. My biggest challenges, to be honest, Ken, are when you speak to a comedian or their manager or their talent agent or their lawyer, it's usually a 1-2 reaction. The first reaction is, who are you? And the second reaction is, wait a second, this sounds too good to be true. And I understand both of them. In the music industry, I'm known. In the comedy world, I'm not as well known. And some guy shows up at your door and says, hey, I'm going to help you get a lot of money. The first thing you're like, who the hell are you? And then what is this thing? What are you talking about? Because what comedian has ever said, I'm going to make my fortune off of my underlying literary work rights from the rights of public performance and reproduction?
It's a funny bit.
That. Yeah. But rim shot. Comedians make their money, as I understand it, off of live gigs and off of production deals like TV shows or movies. In the idea that you're going to make your money because there's a stream of a sound recording or a video on YouTube for your underlying literary work, it's never occurred to you. And why should it? Until somebody like me shows up. And I start going through the nuances. And what's else has occurred is the entire world has moved to global consumption of media, right? And every time media is consumed globally, be it on YouTube or Spotify or Amazon or, pick your poison, those licenses need to be in place and those payments need to get made. So comedy came in after music as far as being utilized by these companies. And now it's being consumed, trillions of streams, and whoops, we forgot to get the licenses, or we chose not to get the licenses. We wanted to wait till we got caught with our hand on the cookie jar, and we've made no royalty payments. And that now is substantive. That's real money. That's like 6, 7, 8 figures of income a year. And that needs to start flowing into these guys' pockets.
Now, just to play devil's advocate, some would argue that the comedic value is in the delivery and the performance and not the actual material. If I were to take George Carlin's material and perform it myself, I guarantee I'm not going to be walking back and forth to the mailbox to grab the residual checks. It's just not going to happen.
Absolutely right. Couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that there isn't that second copyright, nor does it mean that when Peter, Paul, and Mary performed Blowin' in the Wind as written by Bob Dylan, that Bob Dylan shouldn't have been compensated. Just because Peter, Paul, and Mary did a version of it that brought it to fame doesn't mean that Bob Dylan shouldn't have been compensated. So it's sort of the inverse of what we're discussing now. Yeah, look, Chris Rock delivering his material is the reason why that material has value for the most part, right? It's the way he does it, the rhythm, the cadence, the pitch, the tone, the pauses.
He makes it funny. The material's not funny by itself.
Yeah, and so the delivery is definitely part of it, not just part of it, like a good chunk of it. But that still doesn't mean that underlying copyright, Robin Williams coming up with reality. Wow, what a concept. That has a value. That is a copyrighted, protected piece of property. Now, Robin Williams pitching those lines, saying those lines, gives it even more flavor, even more value. But that doesn't mean he is not responsible. Anymore, George Carlin in the 7 Dirty Words You Can't Say on Television. Yeah, sure, George Carlin does that better than anybody in the world, but what he wrote, the genius of what he wrote, is still there. Same with Chappelle. I understand that he's in controversy right now, but Chappelle, that man is a genius in the way he comes up with words and the presentation. It's mind-numbing. And with Richard Pryor, another one, right? These people, Margaret Cho, they're geniuses. And then they add something on top of their observational comedy or their insight by the way they present it. And remember, comedy is culture. These comedians can topple regimes. Comedy gets squashed in countries like North Korea. Freedom of speech, the ability to discuss controversial things, bring flavor to it. It's always been very important. So yeah, I believe the underlying idea is incredibly important. That copyright has value. The delivery does as well. Get the 2 licenses and make the 2 payments. And if you don't want to, then don't use it.
Jeff, when should a royalty be paid? I've heard that with music, there's a such thing as a sample, a certain length of music that can be used without paying. Is this true also for the spoken word?
Well, first of all, that's
like if I play
incorrect.
Where's the Beef? If I just play that drop, do I owe anybody anything?
Well, the first thing is there is no such thing as, if I only sample 1 or 2 seconds of somebody else's stuff, I don't need a license. That's simply not true. You need a license. The second thing is, where's the beef? I'm going to assume that the recording of that and the concept, those words, is owned and controlled by the entity that controls Wendy's, right? They hired an ad agency as a work for hire. The ad agency came up with the concept and the campaign, and I believe that is owned by Wendy's. Now, the question is, does Wendy's want to enforce its copyright? Now, if Where's the Beef is a branding exercise, right? They are, and they're not going to come after you and they know you're using it. They're going to choose not to do anything. But what if you're Burger King and you use Where's the Beef? Now they're going to come after you. Right?
And by the way, the person who came up with that Where's the Beef campaign passed away recently. So if we could have a little moment of silence. Okay, that's good.
Okay, there we go. That was good. So yeah, it's all contingent, right? And this is what I mean by the freedom to make your own choices and what you want. If a comedian wants to choose to give up their copyrights for free, God bless them. On the other hand, if they'll say, listen, Spotify, your value is predicated on market share. You make no money. You're using my work to get there. It's fine. Just, get a license and make a payment. Then they should be able to do that.
Now, you've had run-ins with Spotify in the past. If Spotify was Santa Claus, you would definitely not be on their good list. You'd be on the naughty list. What has happened in the past, and what's going to happen now? Is this a game of chicken? Is it whoever flinches first is going to lose?
Well, I don't think I'd be on their naughty list. I think I'd be on
You've pissed them off, though.
No, I don't think I pissed them off. I think what I did was reveal the fact that Spotify was using people's copyrights without licenses. I'm not responsible for them stealing people's stuff.
You just pointed it out.
I don't blame the victims. I mean, they did a bad thing, and then somebody caught the fact that they did a bad thing. And then they get mad at the person that caught them for doing the bad thing. That makes no sense. So the answer to your question is, or the first response is yes. I had some similar experiences in the past with Spotify, where I was working for Bob Dylan and I was working for Thomas Dolby and Jason Mraz and George Thorogood and and even Dolly Parton and a lot of musical songwriters. And I discovered that Spotify didn't seem to get the licenses and weren't making the royalty payments necessary for the songs. Bob Gaudio is another one. He wrote all the songs, a good chunk of the songs for Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And every time those recordings streamed, Bob Gaudio is supposed to get paid some money because he wrote the song. And he wasn't getting paid. And he wasn't getting paid, it turns out, because apparently it appeared he wasn't licensed. And so all of that turned into a big brouhaha. There was a class action lawsuit against Spotify. There was a second class action lawsuit against Spotify. It got merged together. There was a settlement with the National Music Publishing Association, a trade organization representing Universal, Warner, Sony, sort of the big music publishers. There were 5 direct action lawsuits that I'm aware of. A company called Wixon sued them for a couple $1 billion for willful infringement. 4 companies I worked with sued them. And it all ended up settling. And ultimately, the Music Modernization Act got passed, which appeared to sort of change the rules, right? Spotify wasn't playing by the rules. So rather than play by the rules, they lobbied to change the rules. And they won. They got the rules changed. But it's the same thing. Yeah, it's not just them. It's kind of the way technology works. It's all the dot-com boom. Remember that in the late 1990s, we heard all about the dot-com boom. The dot-com boom, or the business model, is we don't know how we're going to make money. We don't even need to make money. We just need market share. And if we have this market share, we can raise venture capital. We can get high public offerings. We can even go public. And that's sort of the same mantra. And the way things work is you plow forward as a technology company. You're disruptive. And you wait until you get caught with your hand in the cookie jar. And once that happens, much like in that movie, what is it called? Social Network. Rashida Jones is talking to the actor that's playing Mark from, oh God, all my names are going. Who's the founder of frickin' Facebook?
Mark Zuckerberg.
Thank you, Zuckerberg. So Rashida Jones is talking to the actor that's playing Mark Zuckerberg, and he's very pissed off about some things. And she just turns to him and goes, "Look, this is just a speeding ticket, right? It's the same thing. It's the rules now. You go out, you disrupt."
Yeah, it's like the oil companies dumping billions of gallons of oil into the water, and then they pay the fine, which might be $500 million, but they made $20 billion in profit. So what do they care? That's just the cost of doing business.
Exactly. And it becomes a parking ticket, and it's just the way it works. But the problem is it's kind of like the movie Mad Max, where you turn around and you look behind you down the highway that they came down, and it just decimated the place. I mean, the damage that's been done to the music industry and to the songwriting industry and now comedians, it's significant. It's harmful. It hurts. There's lots of destroyed cars behind us. Now, we just caught you. You're going to have to pay a fee for the damage you just did, but it doesn't fix the damage, right?
They don't care.
It's already been done.
Yeah, they got the job done.
Exactly. They got their public offering. They're worth $40 billion. The founders made their billions. The investors made their billions. And behind us, we have a sea of destroyed cars. So it's just the way the world works. So yeah, they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Typically what will happen is they're going to first deny it, then they'll fight it in order to drive the cost down. It all becomes cost benefit analysis. How much are we going to spend in legal fees to try to stop this from happening? What are the motions? What are the appeals? What is the damage to us from a public perception? Is this decreasing subscribers? And ultimately, they'll come up with a resolution of where they're going to go or how much they're willing to pay to settle the thing. But they're going to try to drive it down. And, it's never easy. You got to wrestle with them.
For any comedians that may be listening or creators of content that are based on the spoken word, what advice do you have, whether they're established names or up and coming? What would you tell them to do to protect their own rights and to make sure that they don't get screwed?
The number one most important thing that any comedian, established or up and coming or otherwise, needs to do to protect their rights is register your copyrights with the U.S. Copyright Office. Because if you do not do that, you are not allowed under the law to pursue statutory damages. In other words, someone can steal your stuff and you're basically fucked. There's very little you can do about it. You can pursue something called actual damages, but actual damages in the world of streaming, where they're paying 0.0006 per stream, it means nothing. Register your copyrights with the U.S. Copyright Office. Fill out the form, because once you have that, you now have the ability to pursue. It's an option. It's a choice to pursue resolution to when someone steals your stuff when they should. If you don't do that, it makes it a lot harder.
Here's a related but unrelated question. 21 kilohertz. What is the meaning behind that name?
Aren't you the host?
Well, I know that the range of human hearing goes up to about 20,000 kilohertz. So 21. So are we exploring the unheard aspect?
I wish I was that clever when I came up with the name for the show. I went online into Google and I typed something about, the hearing range for humans, and 21 kilohertz was one of the responses. So that just became the name of the show.
I can't hear anything above 15,000.
Well, that's because you're old.
Well, yeah, mainly because of a Jay Giles concert I went to in 1978. That harmonica, I couldn't hear anything.
I had a Buzzcock concert that did that to me, and that was loud.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, that's how I came up with it. Honestly,
Kids, protect your hearing.
Yeah. This has been a public service announcement.
Don't be like Jeff Price.
What?
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 What? How long is Spotify going to keep this stuff down, or is it down? Like, what's next? What is there going to be litigation? I'm sure there's going to be litigation, but who's going to bring it? Who's spearheading this whole thing?
Well, I can't speak for what's going on between Spotify and that record label. Remember, it's more complicated. For example, how do the record labels' recordings get on Spotify? Did they do their own deal with Spotify directly to do that? And if they did, what does the agreement say between that record label and Spotify?
Well, I'm sure you've seen some of these agreements. You've seen other agreements, though. Don't they have a boilerplate agreement that they send to everybody?
They can vary. You don't know what's in that agreement. I don't know what was in that agreement. Did the record label warrant and represent to Spotify that they were going to get those rights and they were going to make the payments, or did they say they weren't? And what if the record label didn't do a deal directly with Spotify? What if they went to what we call a distributor, like a third-party company, like the Orchard or an InGrooves or ADA or even a TuneCore or a DistroKid, and used that company to put the recordings into Spotify? Then what was in the contract between the record label and that company? And what did that say? And then for that company, they're in the agreement with Spotify. And what does that agreement say? So I don't know what's going on over there. I don't know all the details. And also, how long have those sound recordings been up and live in that service? And if you knew this was a problem, why did you wait until now to say something, while at the same time making money off of it? And to get even more complicated, if you're the record label and you've just had all your sound recordings taken down from a service like Spotify, is your income going to be choked off? And can you survive that? Are you going to get leveraged? And what does this mean to the comedians and some of the smaller ones where it does matter how much money they get paid from Spotify on a monthly basis? It's much more complicated. And I'm not in the know on that. I just know what I read in the press and I understand the copyright issues. But for me, with word collections, that I do understand. Look, we represent Robin Williams, George Carlin. We represent the Richard Pryor estate, along with the Carlin estate and the Williams estate. We represent Bill Engvall, Bill Hicks estate, Ron White.
So you have agreements with Spotify on behalf of your clients?
I work for the comedians, and the comedians have granted me a right to represent their literary works, their copyrights, that underlying work. Now, I'm not a record label, and I'm not a distributor. I am a copyright administration company. So I simply do my job and I call up places that are using their work and say, hey, do you have a license? And if so, where's the payment? But I'm not the one giving them the recordings, right? I'll go to Sirius XM radio and I'll say, hey, you've just broadcast this recording. I can see that you've done that. I've looked at a statement. Where's the license for the literary work? Where's the payment for that?
So you're enforcing agreements that are already in place.
I'm enforcing the law. I'm enforcing the rules.
Respect my authority.
Well, see, here's the thing, Ken. There might not be an agreement in place. For Sirius XM radio to broadcast Robin Williams sound recordings of Reality What a Concept or his second album, Throbbing Python of Love, right? If they play that on Sirius XM comedy station, which is totally fine, the sound recording has been licensed and this money is being paid for the sound recording. So where's the second separate license for the underlying works that were recorded? Dolly Parton's getting paid because she's a musician, but Robin Williams isn't. Where's the contract? Where's the payment? That's my job. Hey, Sirius XM. Hey, Pandora. Hey, every commercial radio station around the world. Hey, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, YouTube, Google. Where's that license for this second copyright? Where's that payment? You're paying it for music. Why isn't Robin Williams getting paid? Simply because he says Reality What a Concept versus sings it doesn't mean he doesn't have a copyright and doesn't mean he doesn't need to get paid.
So when a radio station pays their BMI and ASCAP fees, which I believe is a percentage of their gross revenue, or I'm not sure how that works exactly, that is not covered under that for the spoken word?
Well, for that to be covered, under that, George Carlin would have to be a member of BMI or ASCAP, and he's not. BMI and ASCAP traditionally represent music, not spoken word. So if you are a radio station and you are playing comedy albums, where did you get the right necessary to that underlying literary work from? It's not with ASCAP or BMI, because for the non-musical stuff, it's, Robin, let's stick with George Carlin. The guy's not a member of ASCAP or BMI. Now, ASCAP and BMI represent songwriters and music publishers. They represent the Dolly Partons of the world, the songs, right? But this isn't a song.
So Steve Martin's King Tut would be covered, but not
if Steve Martin. Well, if Steve Martin was a member of ASCAP
Let's Get
or
Small.
BMI, or Cruel.
Well, that was actually a very big hit, the King Tut.
It was.
Yeah.
But remember, ASCAP and BMI are third-party companies. Someone like a Steve Martin can choose to become a member of them or not. He doesn't have to. So if he is not a member of a music rights organization like that, and a radio station plays King Tut, which was a bit of a big hit, then the radio station needs that second license to the underlying musical work. And if it's not part of ASCAP or BMI, where did they get it from? They'd have to call Steve Martin directly and get it from him.
What's the takeaway from all this? Where do we go next?
Where we go next is there's a hole in the system. There's a problem. Comedians have value. What they create has value. It matters. It's used by the most valuable companies in the world to drive their value. It's listened to us by societies around the world because it has value. And you know what? They need to be licensed and properly paid, just like everybody else. And if you don't want to do that, then don't use their stuff. It's that simple. There's a hole in the system. We need to fix it. Word Collections does fill that hole. We make it easier for the services. We make it, and we get the copyright holders paid. But that has to be fixed. This is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
How can we learn more about Word Collections?
Wordcollections.com. There's our Twitter account. There's a social. There's YouTube and so forth. But that's a long story short.
Anything else you want to mention before we wrap this sucker up?
No. Really appreciate you doing this interview today, Ken. Thank you.
21 Kilohertz, the art of making money in music. I'm Kenny White. Jeff Price. He's not a guest. This is his show. I'm just visiting.
Not today.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.